Well, for today's class, we're going to talk about the first Americans.
Who were the first Americans?
Well, the first Americans were the people who were here first?
More like last Americans.
What?
Wait, is this Conics?
First Americans. I guess that's as good of a full screen as I'm going to get. Welcome to Mr. Probst's 8th grade U.S. history. This is the first history we're going to do, and today we're talking about the first Americans, the people that were here first. Okay, moving on. How did people get to North and South America? So that's the first big picture question we're trying to make sure we have an understanding of is, well, how did people get here in the first place? So let's take a look. So here's the standard map of the world that you're used to and that I'm used to because we live in the United States. And so when we see maps of the world, it's always going to have the United States primarily located right here so that we can see it and it's right there in focus. And so that's pretty standard, but that's not exactly what we're looking for yet. We want to focus a little more on this view, and you'll notice that this view is different because now all of a sudden we're way over here and we're not used to that. Let's say you grew up in Australia or New Zealand or Indonesia or Southeast Asia or China, Japan or Korea, then you would be very familiar with this view of the world because this view of the world is centered on the people who live here. And they would be very, very familiar with this point right up here. Here's the focus, okay? Because this is going to be so important in us understanding how the first people came to America. It's going to be called the Beringia Land Bridge. Now, don't worry about taking notes yet because I'm going to walk you through that. But here's the Beringia Land Bridge. It's pretty cool. It had lakes. I don't want you to think of it as being completely frozen. We'll get into that more. But you're like, wait a second, I'm not sure what I'm looking at. So let's see a little bit more in detail. This is Alaska, and you're probably used to maybe seeing what Alaska looks like. But what you may not have known is how close Alaska is to Russia. It's very, very close. And you'll also notice there's this shelf, which means that not that far underneath the water is land. And so if we were to live on an Earth with just a little bit less water, suddenly this isn't ocean, this becomes land. And that is key to understanding Beringia. Because Beringia and human migration took place at a time when there was a lot less water on planet Earth. And that water didn't just disappear, it was frozen in ice. And as you can see here, a large portion of planet Earth was completely covered in enormous glaciers. And that water meant that the average depth of water on planet Earth went down, which meant this that you just saw suddenly was above water. And when it was above water, humans went there. As you can see, in case you didn't know, all humans came from Africa. All of us, right? Homo sapiens came out of Africa and they moved into Europe, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia and Asia. And I always like to think about this point right here, this right here, 1,000,000 years ago. One group of humans went left and one group of humans went right. And 1,000,000 years later, their ancestors met in North America when Europeans first met Native Americans. Now, at that time, we called them Europeans and Native Americans, but really they were humans who at one time were together, who took a very long break from each other and then reconnected. It's pretty cool. The first concept we're going to talk about, glaciers. Glaciers are giant, huge sheets of ice, and they cover land. Okay, Okay, so it's important because glaciers aren't just on top of water. Like when we think of the North and South Pole, we think of a lot of ocean, ice on top. Glaciers were different. They covered land. And as you can see here, during the last ice age, almost all of North America and Northern Europe and parts of Asia were completely covered in glaciers. This time period was known as an ice age. Okay, this information that you see here, we are later going to put into our notes, and I'll be covering that in a bit. Moving forward, here's a good example of a glacier. Giant flow of ice, starting way up in the mountains, but slowly over time flowing downhill. Now these glaciers are so enormous. They have the ability to move rocks and boulders the size of your house, maybe even the size of our school. Just to give you an idea of the scale, if you can see my pointer, you would likely be the size of that pointer. Now imagine trying to cross those glaciers. It would be a pretty difficult affair. The chances of you slipping and falling, never being seen again, would be pretty high. So glaciers aren't really crossable, not with the technology that our ancient ancestors would have had. Now, the second important concept for you to really understand is that the water level in our oceans decreased due to the increase in the size of glaciers. So that's really hard to understand in words, but try to visualize something, right? If you take water and you freeze it, that ice goes up, but the level of water in the cup would go down. So if you think of planet Earth as this giant cup, as we had more ice, the water levels would go down. Here's a good example of about a 100-year difference between 2012 and 1913. Right, at one point there could be giant glaciers. 100 years later, no glaciers, which means glaciers can grow, they can decrease, they can move. Now, if you're sitting there where this gentleman is, and he's looking at that glacier, is it going to look like it's moving? Not at all. But over the course of 100 years, that glacier will move. So the last ice age gives us this opportunity where about 750 miles of land called Beringia appears between Northeastern Asia and North America. And there it is. Now, does that mean that they could have crossed anywhere on here? Absolutely. Was it all covered in ice? Most scientists do not believe so. Is there a chance that they could have crossed somewhere else? Possibly, right? Could the same natives that rode in giant ships from New Zealand or Australia who made it all the way to Hawaii have also made it to North America? That's possible. But there's a little bit more evidence that leads scientists and historians to believe the most likely path was Beringia. So Beringia, as vocabulary, is the last land bridge connection between Asia and North America. So why did people walk all the way from Asia to North America? It's a good question. Why did people do anything? Well, looking back at our ancient ancestors, they might not have been motivated by TikTok or social media or things like that we think of technology, but something you and I today are motivated by is when our stomachs start to growl and we get hungry, what do we get? And what do we want? Food. So we can look at our ancient ancestors as they followed the food. When the things they ate migrated over the land bridge, so did they. These ancient Americans, they were what we call hunter-gatherers, which means they either hunted for their food or they gathered for food. They did not farm, they didn't go to a grocery store, they hunted for their food. So for example, there's a mastodon that you can see there in the center. It looks like a woolly mammoth or an elephant. It's not, it's a mastodon, it's a little different. We actually had those in Missouri. So our ancient ancestors would have followed those all the way down from the Arctic Circle into where we live today. We call people who live this way nomads, and these nomads would have migrated following herds of animals. Now, it's important to remember that these ancient Americans would have lived completely off of these animals. And this is a good example. Their fur would have been used. The different parts of the animal bodies would have been used for all sorts of different things that our ancient aliens would have needed to stay alive. That's going to be something in common with Native Americans that we'll talk about later this year. Now, these early migrations, over time, early Americans migrated to the North and South America, which means they're going to start up here in Beringia, and they're going to make it all the way down to North America and even all the way down to South America. And Europeans aren't going to come until much later and from the other direction. Now, it's also important to note that our ancient Americans aren't just going to across land, but they're also going to use water, and they're going to hop down the coast as they find more animals to live off of and more land that's open with less competition from other humans. Okay, so big picture in general, 25 to 15,000 years ago, our ancient ancestors here in North America would have left Asia, crossed into Alaska, and even have gone all the way down into North America. You'll notice this little blip up here. Some of our ancestors are actually going to stay. These ancient humans will stay up there. And what's very fascinating is that some of these people died in the snow and were frozen in ice, and now because of the warming of planet Earth, scientists are unearthing them. Two neat things coming out of this. They're finding that the people up here had different anatomy than some of the people who went further south, showing that in just 15,000 years, the humans can change based upon their diet and lifestyle. Also, they found that some of these ancient humans died of ancient diseases. So one of the first things they were concerned about was, could there be zombie viruses still alive from these ancient humans, frozen and trapped in time and ice, that could reinfect humans? The good news is those viruses were dead. Still cool. So migration as vocabulary is a movement of people or animals from one region to another. And nomads are a person or group of people who move from place to place in search of food. That's what I'm going to be doing here pretty shortly because it's almost lunchtime. Here's Mastodon State Park. It's very close to St. Louis, not too far away. You can Google it. It's about 30 minutes south of Valley Park, near Festus. You can actually go and you can see where they've dug up mastodons that were in this area. There it goes, Mastodon State Historic Site. It's pretty neat. You should check it out. That's a giant. I'll give you a chance to guess. What do you think that is? Well, that is an ancient sloth. And what's really crazy about it is it's twice the size of a human. So can you imagine a sloth twice the size as you and me, slowly moving around the forest of Missouri eating? Now, why are there no sloths anymore? Well, as you might guess, something that slow is going to be somewhat easy to hunt, and our ancient ancestors were very good at hunting and gathering. Okay, I'm going to show you this slide here. Here's our 2-column notes. I'm going to be giving you another video walking you through this the first time, but as you watch these presentations, you're going to get used to taking notes. On the left-hand side, you'll have your notes, and on the right-hand side, you'll have your thinking. So we've got 2 topics, the last ice age and early migrations. You'll put your information from the slides there, and your thinking will go there on the right-hand side. Now, you can borrow some of my thinking that I've offered in this video, and you're certainly welcome to think about things from your own perspective. The next thing we're going to look at is sort of breaking down questions, vocab, and answers and summary. So there were 2 questions I gave you as we went through this presentation, and I've provided some answers to them, and I'd like you to provide answers for them as well. Those will go in the right-hand column. There's also a place for vocabulary, and you have your vocab on the left-hand side and your definitions will be on the right. And then down where it says summary, you're going to take all of the information above and you're going to basically write a quick summary or story that explains how they all connect together. Okay, that ends this presentation. And look for another from me, from Mr. Probst. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on another one soon.